Midnight has a way of making the world feel thinner. On New Year's Eve, that thinness can become a cut. I still wake up sometimes with the sound of tires on ice in my head, the glint of a knife, a bright flash on a frozen lake. 3 moments I should be able to explain and can't. These are true stories. I was there for all of them. They still haunt me. I'm the kind of person who records things on my phone when I can't sleep. Little voice notes, half-remembered details, a shaky attempt to pin down memory before it slips. That's how these came back to me. Clipped sentences, fragments of smell and light, names that won't stop repeating in my mind. I want to tell them straight. If you like real weird stories, hit subscribe and tell us your own New Year's Eve fright in the comments. Story 1. The Roadside Knife. We left the party late. It was that liminal hour between one year and the next when everyone is both exhausted and wired, when laughter gets thin and songs feel like they were written for last calls. Duda was in the passenger seat, leaning back, half asleep. The heater was on full because we couldn't get the chill out of our bones. There was a rock playlist on, the sort of thing you leave on to keep you awake on bad roads. I remember the tires, more than anything, the way they talked to the ice, a thin, nervous whisper under the conversation. The road cut through fields and small stands of trees. Streetlights were sparse. We were careful, cautious. Maybe we were doing 30, maybe 25, I don't know. Then she was there. She was standing in the middle of the lane, her silhouette an unnatural interruption of the dark. At first I thought she was a hitchhiker, a person stranded. Then the flash of metal caught the headlights. A kitchen knife, the kind you don't expect to see outside someone's hand. She wasn't waving us off. She just stood, knife held like a question. I hit the brakes. The car slid. Everything compressed into seconds. The wheel catching, the back end swinging wide because the road had turned to glass under us. The headlights painted her face for a beat. Not the face I remember clearly now, but a look of something between anger and a sad, determined calm. When we spun, the car briefly presented its side to her. She moved toward us in a way that wasn't purely walking. She lunged at the glass. The windshield took the first contact, a long scrape that sounded like metal on bone even though it wasn't. She slashed at the glass, left streaks and a jagged tear. For a second she was climbing the hood, hair in her eyes, the knife angling toward the cowl. I remember my hands learning how to do one thing, how to make the engine accept every possible amount of torque. I revved. The car lurched forward. She rolled off into the ditch. We drove. We left her there in the glare of our taillights, small and framed by the trees. Duda shouted that we had to call someone. I kept driving because I didn't know what else to do. We argued about it in the car, a backward conversation from the future. Was it safer to leave the scene or to stop? Duda said the woman had tried to kill us, and maybe she had. I said we didn't know if she was hurt or needed help. She said we couldn't be naive out there, that staying might get us killed. We called the police. I remember dialing at a stoplight further down, my fingers numb, voice thin as the frost. We filed a report. We gave them the location as best we could. A clumsy triangulation of mile markers and landmarks. They said they'd check it out. That was the end I knew how to hand over. Paper, tone, a promise to look. The car was damaged enough that it had to go in for repairs. The windshield had a spiderweb of cracks. The hood had a dent, and there were scuffs like fingernail tracks along the bumper. Insurance runs its little checklist, and we were on our way toward the practical, toward making an incident something you can file under claim. But the practical doesn't scrub the feeling of what you left behind. I started checking the news obsessively in the half-hour pockets when my brain would allow something besides replaying the sound of the tires. Local feeds, police logs, the small-town online groups where people post about lost dogs and weird fireworks. For weeks I looked for a mention, a woman found, a hospital admittance, anything. Nothing tied to that stretch of road. It was as if whatever had happened sitting there in the ditch either didn't reach public record or slipped under the cracks of those systems we tell ourselves keep us accountable. The guilt came in waves. It woke me. It sat heavy when I used the car. In the days after, Duda and I argued about responsibility more than we talked about anything else. She kept saying, "We could have died," and I kept saying, "We could have saved someone." Those sentences were less about objective truth than about the vacuum inside me that couldn't accept either option without tearing me apart. It was hard to have a conversation that didn't ricochet between accusation and self-defense. Small things became markers of ruin: the sound of brakes, a flash of headlights, the mention of knives on the news. We tried to be adult about it. We told ourselves we had done the right thing by calling the police, by keeping ourselves alive. But my memory kept retaking the same film, and in the film I paused on the woman rolling off the hood and being left on the roadside. At nights I would imagine the worst and the most mundane at once: the knife sliding, the cold locking into her bones, someone else passing by and asking what happened at that curve. Sometimes I would imagine that she got up and walked away. Sometimes I would imagine that she was found. Most nights I would imagine neither, and the not knowing became a kind of punishment. Months later the relationship with Duda frayed. There were other reasons: the stress of everyday life, different hopes. But the fissure that grew around that night never quite closed. Guilt magnifies small things. When two people want different stories about the past, there's no third person to arbitrate. I remember standing in our tiny kitchen, the light above the sink casting a harsh rectangle, and realizing we were arguing less about the past and more about who we were allowed to be because of it. We broke up not in one dramatic scene, but in a slow series of miscommunications and silences that finally made the choice for us. I never found a definitive follow-up on that woman. The police file, the fragments of my reports, the conversations with officers. Those are all records of attempts to transfer moral responsibility to a system. They were necessary, and they were not enough. I live with the possibility that we left someone needing help and failed to provide it. I also live with the possibility that stopping could have ended us both. I don't have a clean answer. I only have memory and the way guilt can become a second person living in your house. We thought it was over. We were wrong. If you think that's strange, wait until you hear about a woman who crossed time zones she couldn't possibly cross. Story 2. Mitra, or Maitri. It started at a rooftop party, the kind where people pretend to be casual with strangers because the city lights make everyone look cinematic. I met her there. She had an easy laugh and paint on her fingers. I remember the smear of blue on the side of her palm like a badge. She said she was a painter. She said her name like a small riddle. Maitra, she pronounced it carefully. And then, joking, she said, "You can call me Maitri, if that helps you remember." And we both laughed. We spent the night talking. She had stories the way some people keep postcards, small, vivid scenes that made her feel 3 places at once. She told me about cats, Mia and Cosmo. She joked about her birthday being April 28th. She said she was from San Diego, that she'd done murals and had worked with a crew tagging underpasses. She showed me a faded photo on her phone with both cats perched like guardians on a couch. I remember the softness in her voice when she said Mia, affection that made me think of someone who knows the small domestic details of another life. She stayed the night. We woke up to the strange intimacy of the morning after, when the world outside the apartment feels suspended. She left her purse behind, and after an hour, she was gone. The apartment door was locked. Her coat was gone. Her phone was gone. There was no number written anywhere. No contact info slipped into a book. If this sounds careless, that's exactly how it felt, like a vanishing act, too clean to be simple forgetfulness. I assumed she would show up. People disappear from my life all the time. Flights, schedules, last-minute decisions, but they usually circle back. This one didn't. I started to text the name the way a person will when they're savoring a memory. Small notes, nothing demanding. No replies. I tried to look her up the way you look for someone when you have hope you won't find them. Social feeds, art collectives, mural pages. I came up empty. And then, like a shard of ice, my phone buzzed with a message that snapped everything into the impossible. Garrett had been traveling. He was in Hong Kong for a few days on business, and in one message he said casually, "I think I met someone tonight who could have been your friend." He sent a photo. It was the same face. I stared at the image, and the little details crawled up inside me like questions. The tilt of the head, the paint smudge, the cat's phrasings she had used. He described what he'd heard, the same painting stories, the same joke about my tree, a small offhand mention of April 28th. He told me where he'd run into her, a food stall outside a club near a busy pier, and which conversation they'd had. The hour stamp on his text said it was hours earlier than when I met her on the rooftop. We did the math together because it was the only way to turn a wild possibility into an exact, hard impossibility. San Diego and Hong Kong are separated by a time zone that, depending on the time of year, puts Hong Kong about 15 or 16 hours ahead of San Diego. Flights between the two cities are not a matter of grabbing a cheap overnight hop. They take more than half a day door-to-door, often with layovers. Flights of 13 or 14 hours at least in the air, longer with connections and gate time. Even if you could fold time like a map, the timeline didn't support the idea that she'd been in both places in the same night. We checked the timestamps on Garrett's photos. We cross-checked the proximity of his location to where he said he had been. I traced what I could of the rooftop guest list and asked if anyone had seen a woman with paint on her fingers. Nobody had evidence, except for particulars that matched too neatly. The April 28th joke, Mia and Cosmo, a painter's hands. We exchanged photos. We compared angles and background blur. There are ways photos can deceive. Filters, lookalikes, poor resolution. But this wasn't someone who could be explained away as a casual resemblance. The same small tattoo, the same chipped front tooth, the same smudge of blue on the knuckle. The more we compared, the less our ordinary categories held. What did this mean? Was she traveling somehow faster than planes? Had we slept with a woman who was simultaneously somewhere we could prove she wasn't? Was it a prank where two strangers learned the same details and fed them back? Was it a case of shared attention where a pattern made us see the same thing twice? Or was it something that sits outside our conception of cause and effect and pushes on the seams of what we call possible? I went online like a person chasing a rabbit down an internet hole. I searched mural forums, artist directories, even public cat registries, anything that might confirm that the name and the cats matched a stable online presence. Occasionally I found a little trace that fit one detail or another, but never a profile that matched everything. Garrett scoured the messages from Hong Kong again, and then deleted them as if by repeating them he could make them less urgent. We tried to get clarity without deciding on an answer, which is a strange state, simultaneously desperate and cautious. There were other people who tried to offer rational explanations, which is what friends do when faced with something they prefer to pin down. Maybe she was two different people with similar details. Maybe we had invented the link because we wanted one. Maybe life is messy and coincidences do happen. Those are possibilities. I kept returning to another possibility, the one that made my skin prickle at night, that we had both encountered the same person in ways that didn't line up with ordinary travel time. I can't say she was a ghost. I can't say she wasn't. What I can say is that the detail that clung in my throat was not only the impossibility, but the intimacy of the night. I'd been in a warm bed with someone who had spoken the names of her cats like they were children, who had shown me a photo and a joke and a smudge of blue, and then she'd evaporated without contact. And elsewhere, hours earlier, someone I trust had a picture and a story that matched mine too much to be coincidence. After that night, I found myself watching doors and windows with a new kind of attention. I checked flight trackers maybe more often than is reasonable. I scrolled for the name Matra and Mia and Cosmo until my thumb hurt. Sometimes I wondered if the woman's life was tidy and real, and simply refused to surface online because she valued privacy. Other times I wondered if telling the story aloud made it less wild, gave it edges I could handle. Garrett still jokes about it sometimes, half laughing, like a man trying to make a ghost into a bar anecdote. I don't laugh the same way. That night taught me that people can be more ephemeral than we like to imagine, or that something in the world resists being entirely rational. I have no final answer. I have only the cold little details that refuse to line up, and a photograph that keeps coming back to me like a face in a sleep-deprived dream. If you thought coincidences were harmless, that was before the third night. Story 3. The Light on the Lake. This one involves my father, Victor, and a very different kind of quiet. We drove up to Vermont for a family New Year's trip when I was younger. A lodge by a frozen lake, full-length windows, the kind of place where the inside is wood and warmth, and the outside is a white, breathy silence. My dad likes places like that. A stove to tend, a chair that keeps shape, a small routine. There was Victor, Lisa, Mom, and me, gathered in a house built for the sort of togetherness that feels holiday-sized. The lake lay like a blink beneath the windows. You could stand there and feel like you were looking into a winter's white bowl. We had a simple, contained celebration. We ate, we drank, we traded stories that had been told and retold until they took on a family gloss. Midnight, in those circumstances, is almost an afterthought. The night is long and the countdown is a thing you enact out of habit, but the limbic feeling of the holiday is more about being anchored in the same room as other people who remember the same things as you. Then something happened across the lake that wasn't about calendars anymore. A bright ground-level flash of light went across the ice. It came from no obvious source, not a torch, not a car, and it had the quality of being at eye level with the frozen surface, as if someone had lifted a hand and set a lamp down on the ice line. There was no accompanying sound. The glass didn't carry the thrum of an explosion, or the high ring of a drone, or anything mechanical. It was just light, very bright and then gone, leaving the night to reassert itself like nothing had happened. At the same time, from somewhere in that whiteness, someone cried, "Help!" Not muffled, not distant, but a clear child's voice that made the small hairs on the back of our necks stand up. I remember my father saying, "There," and stepping from the kitchen toward the door without the deliberation you might expect. Victor and another friend, a man named Victor in this case, who is the kind of person who will act before he thinks, were the first ones out. The men walked carefully onto the ice, boots crunching, breath fogging in the cold. We stayed inside, half internal with the alertness that comes when the safe post-Christmas bubble is punctured. They walked and their footsteps continued to the spot where the light had been. And then, just like that, the light flashed again and the figure was gone. One moment there was a small boy, or the smear of a small boy, and the next moment nothing but a ghost-shaped absence. They called, their voices swallowed by the winter. They scanned the ice with flashlights and found nothing. No truant child, no footprints leading away in snow. It was as if the boy had been a sudden possibility that had closed its book. When they returned to the house, slightly shaken and trying to recompose themselves, some of us expected questions like, "Did you see a marker? Someone else out there?" But the obvious questions didn't lead to answers. No cars were parked along the access road. No other houses showed light. The house itself felt like a vessel unnecessarily full of unease. Later, in the middle of the night, someone, my father I think, heard a child's laugh inside the house, faint as if coming from the walls. They checked the rooms. There was no child. There was no one in the hall. The laugh was real enough to cause people to stand in doorways and listen until the sound evaporated. We cut the trip short the next morning. We packed up like people moving away from a place that had returned a question we couldn't stand to ask under a roof. Dad never talked about it much afterward. When I asked him, months later, he shrugged and said, "Some nights are like that. You don't talk about them." He always had a way of closing the mouth of a story like a lid. That blankness stuck with us. The detail that keeps returning is not just the bright flash or the vanished boy, but the fact that it happened on New Year's Eve. That night when worlds feel close because one year is dying and another is being born. I think about how stubborn the human mind is to want to collapse events into causes and effects, and how helpless it feels when it can't. Whatever we witnessed was not rendered less strange by the people who refused to speak about it. If anything, the silence made it louder. We never learned whether someone else had seen the light from the far side of the lake or whether the land itself produced a brief, inexplicable phenomenon. We never found a logical origin for the voice. We told stories about it in the years after, half jokes, half conversations. But when you try to put words on something that resists them, the words wobble. The memory is mostly holes, which is perhaps why it never stops prodding. The other nights, the woman with the knife and the vanished painter taught me about choices and moral fallout. This one taught me that sometimes the world will present you with a question and then close the door on your answer. You are left with only the residue of it, cold in the bones, a feeling of being watched by something that wasn't looking at you personally, but happened to pass by. Climbing out of the dark. 3 nights. 3 different kinds of thinness. A person in the road with a knife. A woman who appears in 2 cities where she could not feasibly be. A flash on a frozen lake and a child's vanished voice. All of them happened around the hour when one year folds into another, and I can't help but connect the timing to the mood the night brings. Thresholds. The idea that a second is both the end and the beginning. Maybe that's why these moments push at me so stubbornly. There is a liminality to New Year's that encourages the mind to treat the world like a set of sliding panes. If reality is usually a solid window, then at midnight it sometimes feels like a veil you can accidentally slip your fingers through. I don't have the one explanation that makes sense of all 3. In the first story, I wrestle with the ethics of leaving someone behind and the way guilt corrodes relationships. In the second, I'm forced to reckon with a bizarre duplication that refuses to fit into anything tidy. In the third, I'm confronted by a silent, bright event and an absence I can't reconcile. Each of these leaves an aftertaste. The metallic tang of fear, the sourness of not knowing, the soft, unreal glow of something that might fit in a fairy tale but does not belong anywhere we can safely file. People I talk to want a solution. They want to call the first a night of panic and move on, say the second is an internet-age trick, and label the third a meteorological oddity. These are not invalid responses. They are simply not my experience. My experience is that these nights live in me like old scars. Not announced, not always visible, but there. They occur to me in the small shocks of everyday life, a radio report about a missing person, a flicker of a light in the corner of a room, a photograph that looks like a ghost. Sometimes the memory slams the lid down on me as if I haven't learned the rules yet. The hardest thing is living with the moral residue. After the roadside incident, I replayed my choices until the edges of the memory blunted into anxiety. After the sampler of impossible travel with Mitra, I kept asking if I had made contact with something beyond everything I knew. After the Vermont trip, I found myself listening for laughter that might not be there. Every one of these nights urged me to examine how small ordinary acts, breaking too late, lending a couch, looking out the window, can have enormous, unwieldy consequences. It makes you aware of how deceptively thin the partition between the ordinary and the extraordinary can be. Sometimes when I try to sleep and the noise in my head ramps up, I think about moral courage and the cost of indecision. In the first story, it was literal. A choice between staying and risking harm or leaving and risking a conscience. In the others, the choices were subtler. How to search for truth, how to decide what to tell other people, how to keep living when certain things cannot be explained. None of those decisions come with a manual. They come with the small consolations of doing what you can, filing a report, checking available leads, telling the story to someone you trust so it is no longer a secret between you and the dark. And then there is the uncanny duplication of people's stories, the way names and details repeat. We want identity to be solid. We need it to be. But sometimes identity turns out to be a set of pointers that can lead 2 people to the same face on the same night and leave us scrambling for meaning. Maybe there is an explanation. Maybe there isn't. The thing that unsettles me isn't only that we are left without answers, but that those unanswered moments collect in the corners of your life until they begin to define the shape of things. What I invite you to do is not to adopt my unease, but to notice the kind of nights that open up a little valley of possibility in your memory. New Year's Eve is ritualistic, a night when we expect a change. Maybe that expectation makes our senses sharper, or maybe the world itself is more restless then. Either way, if you have a New Year's story that sits like a stone in your shoe, tell it. Speak it out. Put it in the comments. We are strangers here with similar oddities. Sometimes telling a story is the only way to stop it from looping in your head. My father used to say that there are nights you don't talk about because the silence protects you from making the memory heavier. I no longer think that's always true. Sometimes silence lets memories fester. Sometimes telling them aloud moves them into a different category. I keep telling these three because putting them into words is a small, stubborn refusal to let them remain only in the dark. Share this episode and leave your story below. We might feature it. And subscribe for more real nightmare tales. If you've ever been on a road where the dark feels too close, or if a stranger disappeared from the place you thought they were, or if you saw a light that made the world pivot for a second, write it down. Tell someone. Maybe in that exchange, the thin places get a bit less sharp. I don't know what any of these nights really were. I only know that they happened, and that they are still with me. They still come up in the quiet when I am not ready for them, and they remind me that the world is bigger and stranger and more morally complicated than our small explanations let it be. They haunt me. Maybe they'll haunt you too. Or maybe they'll make you look twice before you assume the world is closed and safe at midnight. Either way, New Year's Eve is a night to be watched with both care and humility.